Welcome to this year's Come Follow Me curricula, the Old Testament. When I said the Old Testament, what was your response? Did you groan a little? Or are you excited to study the Old Testament? If we're honest, most everyone probably groaned a little. Yet the Old Testament sets us up for all the other scriptures. It's here we learn about the creation and the fall, the Abrahamic covenant, and the words of Isaiah. From beginning to end, there is a lot to learn, but you have to start out right. Like as Joseph Smith said in the King Follett Discourse, if we start right, it is easy to go right all the time. But if we start wrong, we may go wrong, and it will be a hard matter to get right. So, welcome to Face Towards Zion. Let's discuss Moses 1 and Abraham 3. Pictured is shown a photo of an old copy of the Masoretic text. To understand the Old Testament, we have to understand its story. I'll begin with that. To begin with, how many books are there in the Old Testament? An easy way to remember is to count the letters in the word old. There are 3. Then count the number of letters in the word Testament. There are 9. Then combine the 3 and the 9 and you get 39. There are 39 books in our current Old Testament. Interestingly, the number of letters in the words New Testament are also 3 and 9. But for the New Testament, you multiply them together. 3 times 9 gives 27. The New Testament has 27 books. Many in our current society no longer use the term Old Testament. This term is considered derogatory to the Jews, hinting that it is outdated and something has supplanted it. But if you're a Christian, that is pretty much your stance. Something has been added to it, the New Testament. But the New Testament has not superseded the Old Testament, it just adds and expands it. But we should be aware that in the academic circle, the Old Testament is now referred to as the Hebrew Bible. These writings were originally written in Hebrew and some Aramaic, and so it is referred to as the Hebrew Bible. Still, the Hebrew Bible is different to what we call the Old Testament. This year's study of the Old Testament will be wonderful, and there's also the law that you will get out of it as much as you put into it. If you neglect it, then you probably won't learn that much. But if you study it, you will receive wonderful insights. And although I'm slow in posting, hopefully I will be here to help a little bit. Remember, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Our society right now is struggling, especially if you listen to the news. Now more than ever, we need a rock to hold on to, a safe place. The history of the Old Testament is the history of a people in a similar situation. If we don't learn from them, we are doomed to repeat what they did. Sadly, the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is a story about a people that never quite lived up to their potential. Interestingly, there are a few exceptions. Enoch and Melchizedek both built Zion societies, but we still haven't built Zion today. It is up to us to build Zion, and interestingly, the Old Testament can help us learn that process. Now, I would like to begin with 1 Nephi chapter 10, verse 19. For he that diligently seeketh shall find, and the mysteries of God shall be unfolded unto them by the power of the Holy Ghost, as well in these times as in the times of old, and as well in times of old as in times to come. Wherefore, the course of the Lord is one eternal round. If we want to find Zion, we must diligently seek for it, and the mysteries of God shall be unfolded unto them. If we want to learn the mysteries of God, we have to search for them. Sorry, but even by being a good person, these are not just going to fall in our lap. We can only find the mysteries of God by searching for them. So in old times, Enoch and Melchizedek especially, they found God, they found Zion. How will we do it today? Well, the course of the Lord is one eternal round. We will find it today in the same way they found it. The formula for us to build Zion is the same as the formula they used. There is no magic way to it. We must be a Zion people. And where do you learn this process? From them. And they left their record in the Old Testament. We must begin there. Now, to understand the Hebrew Bible, we must understand how it came to us. Anciently, they spoke Hebrew, and the words were originally written in Hebrew. That's why it's called the Hebrew Bible. The oldest copies of the Bible that we have in Hebrew are called the Masoretic text. Interestingly, it's called the Masoretic text because between the 7th and 10th centuries, a group of rabbis called the Masoretes copied, edited, and distributed the text that had been passed down to them. Due to this group, we call these old texts in Hebrew the Masoretic text. But to understand the history, we have to understand the people. As the Hebrew people passed through generations, their language evolved to not only Hebrew, but also to Aramaic. So when Christ lived, the main language was Aramaic, but there were other things going on around them. One of the biggest events in history was the conquest of an individual called Alexander the Great. Alexander was born to King Philip. He was tutored by Aristotle until the age of 16. Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedonia at the age of 20, at which time he promptly began a military campaign and first consolidated Greece. He was able to combine all of the armies of Greece, and then he set out to conquer the world. He was a brilliant military general. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered to be one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the world. By the time he was 32, he conquered the known world at the time. That included Palestine and Egypt. Since they now ruled the world, the influence of the Greeks became dominant. Today, much of the world speaks English. If you want to do business most anywhere in the world, you need to know English. In fact, did you know if you speak 2 languages, you are considered to be bilingual? If you speak more than 2 languages, you are called multilingual. But do you know what you are called if you speak only 1 language? You are called an American. Many Americans only speak English, but pretty much everyone else in the world will speak at least their language and also English. So back in that day, if you were part of the main society, you pretty much had to learn Greek. The Hebrew people continued to maintain their Hebrew culture, but there was a strong Greek or Hellenistic culture. For this reason, they translated their Greek words of God into Greek. Beginning in 285 BC, a group of 70 elders got together and translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Now, there are multiple stories of how this happened. Some say it was 70, others say it was 72, which was composed of 6 individuals from each of the 12 tribes, making a total of 72. Of course, some have argued that the 10 tribes had long been dispersed by then, but we know from the Book of Mormon that there were people from the northern tribes that had migrated to Judah before the carrying away of the 10 tribes. Regardless, due to the number of 70, they called this translation the Septuagint. This word is actually Latin, with septum meaning 7 and ginta meaning 10 times. So 7 times 10 gives 70, or Septuagint. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation from the original Hebrew. It is also referred to as LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70. This translation is very pivotal and very important. Some of the oldest transcripts we have of the Bible go back to the Septuagint instead of the Masoretic text. Often there seems to be mistakes in the Masoretic text that are filled in by using the Septuagint. For example, Psalm 145 is an acrostic poem. This means that each line of the psalm begins with a successive letter from the Hebrew alphabet. So if this were in English, the first line would begin with the letter A, the second line with the letter B, etc. for a poem of 26 lines. The Masoretic text follows this format, except it skips the Hebrew letter Nun. If you translate the Septuagint back into Hebrew, the missing line which begins with the letter Nun is there. It says, "The Lord is faithful in his words and holy in all his works." So in some instances, it seems the Septuagint probably follows what was originally in the Bible better than the oldest Masoretic text that we have today. Well, after the Greeks came the Romans. Their native language was Latin. So a few hundred years later, this whole process starts over. Now, if you're going to be anyone in society, you had to speak Latin. In 382, Jerome translated the Bible using both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint into Latin. This text is called the Vulgate. Now, have you ever visited the chapel of the Nativity in Bethlehem? If you go there, of course, the big tourist draw is that this is the traditional place where Christ was born. And there is a big to-do about the exact spot where Christ was supposedly born. A few years ago, we visited this place and our guide just casually mentioned, oh yeah, and it was in the basement in caves underneath this chapel is where Jerome translated the Vulgate. Now, personally, I don't think the traditional spot is where Christ was really born, but the caves underneath is the literal spot where Jerome translated the Vulgate. So this is still a very historic location. Now, the Christian church evolved as the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church would speak the Roman language, which is Latin. So the Vulgate became the official Bible of the church for over 1,000 years. This is why some Catholic liturgy still uses the Latin in their ceremonies. So remember that the Vulgate is the Latin translation of the Bible. Now, as history evolved, the Catholic Church held tight to their traditions and controlled the Bible. Throughout the Dark Ages, most people were illiterate anyway, and only the priests had access to the Bible. There were times in history when people tried to change it, such as Charlemagne with the Slavs and then even the Cathars. But the Catholic Church was able to put down those movements. It was really John Wycliffe, a seminary professor at the University of Oxford, who really began the movement to translate the Bible into a language that people could understand. He translated the Vulgate into Middle English and possibly the New Testament as well. He died in 1384, but in 1415 Wycliffe was declared a heretic. His corpse was exhumed and burned and all his writings banned. However, he had sown the seeds of Protestantism, which were led by a German monk named Martin Luther. Martin translated the Bible into German and greatly influenced others such as William Tyndale. By now the movement could not be stopped, but that doesn't mean the Catholic Church didn't try. In 1526, William Tyndale published the Bible into English and printed 3,000 copies. The Catholic Church rounded those up and destroyed them. Today, only 2 of those copies survive. Interestingly, it was King Henry VIII that really furthered this cause, but not because he meant to do it. Ascending to the throne at 17, he agreed to marry Catherine of Aragon. A number of children followed, all dying in infancy, until Mary was born. However, King Henry was fond of his mistresses. As the king grew impatient with Catherine's ability to produce a male heir, he decided it was easiest to annul their marriage and marry Anne Boleyn. Of course, the Catholic Church would not sanction a divorce, so King Henry figured he would just excommunicate the Pope and start his own church, the Church of England. This would keep all the funds going to Rome within England, and the country would be better off. The king now sanctioned the new Bibles, with the Coverdale Bible being the first. King Henry VIII would die in 1547. He would be followed by Edward VI, Jane, Mary I, Philip, Elizabeth I, and finally James. It was King James who commissioned to obtain an official version of the Bible. It was commissioned at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604 and would be published in 1611, the King James Bible. Of course, the Bible would continue to be translated. By the 19th century, it was translated into 400 languages, and today is supposedly translated into over 700 languages. But what is in the Bible? Let's begin with Luke 24:44. In this verse, the resurrected Christ appears to the apostle and says to them, "These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me." What does he mean when he says in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms? The Hebrew Bible is composed of 3 parts: the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. The law of Moses is composed of the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you look at the header for the book of Genesis in your current scriptures, it says the first book of Moses called Genesis. So these 5 books comprise what in Hebrew is called the Torah. This begins with the Hebrew letter Tav, or we today would translate that to the letter T. Now, when it was translated into the Greek in the Septuagint, the word 5 books translates in Greek to Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5 and tukos meaning box, jar, or scroll. So originally it was meant to be a 5-scrolled book. So we get the Greek Pentateuch or the Hebrew Torah. This is often referred to as the Law of Moses or just the Law. The second group in Hebrew is called the Nevi'im, which begins with the letter Nun, or we would translate to the letter N. This means the prophets. So when Christ refers to what is written in the prophets, he is referring to what is written in the Nevi'im. In the Hebrew Bible, this is composed into 8 books. The former prophetic history books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. The former prophets contain the story of the Hebrew nation, with the latter group being the covenantal or prophetic voice. Notice that these books are the same what we have today, but they're different. It is the same content, but today we divide the books of Samuel and Kings into 2 separate books each, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And then we separate the 12 prophets, who are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The third group is what Christ called the Psalms. This group is called the Ketuvim and consists of the writings or poetry, or is even sometimes referred to as the Psalms. So even though it's sometimes referred to as the Psalms, there are more books in it than just the Psalms. The Ketuvim begins with the letter Kaf, or today we would translate it to K or K. It's more of a sound like you're clearing your throat. Generally, it is believed that the books were written under divine inspiration, but has one level less authority than that of the prophecy. This book contains 3 sections, the Emet, the Megillot, and the other books. Sometimes these are all referred to as the Hagiographa. So the Emet, or poetic books, are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. If you take the titles of these books in Hebrew and take the first letter of each book, you get E-M-E-T, which is the Hebrew word for truth. These books are generally written in Hebrew poetry. The next group of 5 books are the Megillot, or the Hamash Megillot, and are composed of the Song of Psalms. Today we usually call this the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. These books are read at the beginning of specific feasts. The Song of Songs during Passover, Ruth during the Feast of Weeks, Lamentations during the anniversary of the destruction of Jerusalem, Ecclesiastes during the Feast of Tabernacles, and Esther during the Feast of Lots or Purim. The last group consists of Daniel, Nehemiah/Esther/Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Again, today we separate Ezra from Nehemiah, and Chronicles is broken into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These books are all chronologically the last books, with significant portions of these books written in Aramaic. So if you take the first letter from each of these 3 sections, you get TaNakh, which is hard to say. Also, Hebrew doesn't include the vowels. By adding the vowels, we get the word TaNakh, which is the name for the Hebrew Bible. Today you can get an English translation of the Hebrew TaNakh. As you would expect, this will differ from our King James Version. For example, in Isaiah, the King James Version will say a virgin will conceive. In the TaNakh, this will be translated to a young woman will conceive. But this is the Hebrew Bible. As I pointed out, the Hebrew Bible is a little different from the Christian Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible has 24 books. The Old Testament has 39, but it is basically the same content. Generally, the Old Testament follows the order of the Greek Septuagint. The Septuagint is divided into 4 major categories: the Law, History, Poetry or Wisdom, and the Prophets. Now, the Septuagint also includes many books of the Apocrypha, so our Old Testament is different from the TaNakh or the Septuagint, even though we follow the order of the Septuagint. All of these books have the first 5 books of Moses as the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The next division is the history books, and we have 3 sections. The first 3, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then the divided up history books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and then the later history books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Here the Septuagint also includes 1st Ezra, Tobit, Judith, and the 3 books of the Maccabees. Our wisdom or poetry books are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. The Septuagint also contains Psalms 151, the Prayer of Manasseh, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, and the Psalms of Solomon. Finally, our book of prophets is divided into the major and the minor prophets. The major prophets, which include the latter prophecy books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, have the books of Lamentation and Daniel included. And finally, the 12 minor prophets are broken out. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And that is the Old Testament that we use today. Now, the Old Testament that we have today is not in chronological order. It kind of weaves in and out. If you were to organize it chronologically, you would get something like what you see here on the screen. Of course, some scholars will debate these dates, and some books cover multiple eras. For example, the Psalms date from 1410 through 450 BC, which about covers the same dates as the rest of the Old Testament. Still, it's nice to get an idea of the chronology of the book. So how can we study the Old Testament today? There are many different versions that give different insights. Which version is best, and how do we study it? I may add the LDS General Handbook in section 38.8.5 says this: English-speaking members should use the Latter-day Saint edition of the King James Version of the Bible. This edition includes the topical guide, footnotes, excerpts from the Joseph Smith translation, cross-references to other passages in the Bible and to the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, and other study aids. Although other versions of the Bible may be easier to read, in doctrinal matters, Latter-day Revelation supports the King James Version in preference to other English translations. So in doctrinal matters, the Church supports the King James Version in preference to other English translations. Now, that being said, sometimes the Old Testament can be unclear, and the King James Version contains the wording as used in 1611. Insights may be obtained from other versions, but how many versions are there, and how many do I get? Well, it seems there are about 900 different translations of the Bible in English, and this seems to be growing every day. Just buying that many translations would be expensive and confusing, so what is a good alternative? One place I would recommend is the Blue Letter Bible. This is an app from our Protestant friends. Now, don't sell their products short. They spend a lot of time in the Bible and often have very good tools. If you have a tablet or a phone, the Blue Letter Bible is a free app. They also have a website. In fact, the picture shown is taken from their website. Now for me, anyways, using the app on a tablet is the easiest. If you look at the slide, you can see all the translations that they have for free. These include the King James, the New King James, the New Living, the New International, the English Standard, the Christian Standard, the New American Standard 2020 and 1995, the New English, the Revised Standard, the American Standard, the Young's Literal, the Darby, the Webster, also the Reign of Valera in 1960 edition in Spanish, the Latin Vulgate, the Westminster Leningrad Codex, the Septuagint, the Morphological Greek, and also on the app, the Basic English, translations in Korean, Portuguese, German, Russian, and others. The point is you can easily get multiple versions at no cost. So once you're on the Blue Letter Bible site, you have to enter in the verse of interest. You can then select the different tools. Besides the different translations, one of my favorite applications is to select the interlinear option. Once that is selected, you will see the King James Version as well as the Masoretic text in Hebrew. You can see the word that is in English and the corresponding word in Hebrew or Greek if you are searching the New Testament. It also gives the Strong's number. Now in the church, we don't often use the Strong's Concordance. In 1890, James Strong's published this concordance that takes every word in the Bible and then it shows how many times that word appears in the Bible, including the different ways it's been translated. You can see the same word is often translated into different words. By comparing these words, you can get a better understanding of the underlying words in Hebrew or Greek. So this is a great tool to better understand the Bible. And best of all, it can be accessed at no cost. Finally, to better understand the Old Testament, I want to briefly cover one other topic, the documentary hypothesis. One area scholars have spent a lot of time in is to determine who wrote what and during what time period. Now, as they have done this, there are going to be errors that have crept in. Surely they are not always correct, and generally they will admit to this. In fact, if you compare it to our understanding of the Book of Mormon, there are times some parts of this hypothesis don't add up, but in other places they do, and this can give us insights into verses that are difficult to understand. For the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it has been speculated that the text was written by 5 different authors, or better, that texts have been included from 5 different sources. Now, before you throw this away, think about it a little. We believe that the Book of Mormon was written down for 1,000 years on the large plates and passed down from author to author. We then believe that Mormon took all of these writings and summarized or redacted these writings into what we today have as the Book of Mormon, and of course there are exceptions. The loss of the 116 pages required the addition of the small plates, and Moroni wrote after Mormon had concluded, but in general the Book of Mormon was compiled by Mormon. The theory of the documentary hypothesis is that writings were originally written down, possibly by Moses, and then those writings went through different stories. Some were kept by people in the northern kingdom, and others were kept by people in the kingdom of Judah. As history passed, these versions were copied and passed from generation to generation. Sometimes the new generation had a different understanding than the previous generation, and so minor changes or clarifications were made to the text. Now, think about the brass plates that Nephi obtained from Laban. These brass plates would have been a copy of the plates from the northern kingdom. They would be a little different from what they kept in the kingdom of Judah. They may even include different books, but some of the particulars would have been changed. Basically, the documentary hypothesis says that these different versions then came down to someone or a group of people that compiled the record. Sometimes the writing was different and they didn't know how to reconcile the differences. So sometimes they just included both versions. This is why sometimes in the Bible stories are told twice, once from each different perspective. For example, there are 2 stories of the creation. One difference I find interesting is that sometimes it says that Moses received the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai. In other references, it says he obtained them from Mount Horeb. Well, which is correct? The idea is that as the stories were passed down, the northern tribes tried to distance itself from the influence of the temple at Jerusalem and instead emphasized Bethel. They emphasized on God's covenant with Israel. In this version, God uses angels and dreams instead of appearing to people directly. When this version addressed God, it almost universally uses the word Elohim. This source emphasized Moses and Abraham as being important. This source is often referred to as the E or Elohis source. Meanwhile, down in Jerusalem, things were different. They had the temple, and so they stressed that God's covenants can only be made in Jerusalem. Instead of Moses and Abraham, they emphasized King David, and the city of David was in Judah. They emphasized that God comes to his people and speaks directly to his prophets. No need for angels or dreams. This version is optimistic that one day Israel will triumph. When referring to God, it will exclusively use the word Yahweh, or today we translate that to Jehovah or Adonai or Lord. This version explains the natural world through stories such as the Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, or Adam and Eve. This source is referred to as the J or Yahweh's source. In addition, there are 2 other sources, the priestly or P source and the Deuteronomist or the D source. The P source promotes the priesthood, it's cultic, and describes salvation comes through ritual. It includes covenants and genealogies. The D source is mainly the book of Deuteronomy. The D source is closer to the E source, the P source closer to the J source. Shown is a chart showing how these different sources intertwine. So what is our takeaway from this? Simply to be aware. Sometimes things make better sense when you understand where it is coming from. Sometimes when a story repeats itself, often with a difference in the details, it can be made better sense of by understanding its origin. Bottom line, God loves his people. He loves us today. By understanding our past, we can better understand our future, and we can build the future, not just allow it to happen. So hopefully this gives you a better understanding of the Old Testament and what we will be studying this year. Today's lesson is really on the premortality. If you look at the lesson manual, it begins with, the Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," Genesis 1:1. But what was there before this beginning? And why did God create all of this? Through the prophet Joseph Smith, the Lord has shed light on these questions. I like how we begin with, "In the beginning." In the 2010 Christmas program with the Tabernacle Choir, the guest artist was Michael York. One of the highlights was a narration he had of the song "Sing Choirs of Angels." In that narration, he told the story of John Perry, who was the first conductor of the Tabernacle Choir. His narration begins with, "To tell a true story truly, one must always begin in the middle. Oh yes, at Christmas we tell of shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, but that was not the shepherds' first night in the fields. They had been on those hills for generations, learning from their fathers and teaching their sons." To find that, search on YouTube, "Sing Choirs of Angels," and you can find that recording. So stories always start in the middle, yet the Bible begins with "in the beginning." What this is really saying is in the beginning of this earth. Or, earlier I quoted that the course of the Lord is one eternal round. Really, each circle has some place where the circle starts. This is the beginning. This in the beginning starts the story of this earth. However, earths have been coming and going many times before this earth. What happened before this in the beginning started? The lesson manual indicates that Joseph Smith shed light on these questions. The lesson focuses on the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis, which we today call the Book of Moses, and also the translation of papyri that we call the Book of Abraham. But the prophet Joseph discussed this topic more than in these places. During my video on the Liberty Jail sections, I mentioned that after the Liberty Jail, Joseph didn't receive a lot of revelations, but focused on sermons. If you look at the sermons delivered in Nauvoo, one of the most famous was the King Follett Discourse. The King Follett Discourse was really a general conference talk where Joseph discussed the recent death of an esteemed member of the church named King Follett. Now, King was actually his first name and not a title. In his discourse, he briefly mentioned King and tied it to the topic of what happens at death. Among other things, the prophet said, "Before I enter fully into the investigation of the subject which is lying before me, I wish to pave the way and bring up the subject from the beginning, that you may understand it. In the first place, I wish to go back to the beginning, to the morn of creation. There is the starting point for us to look to. In order to understand and be fully acquainted with the mind, purposes, and decrees of the great Elohim, who sits in yonder heavens as he did at the creation of this world, it is necessary for us to have an understanding of God himself in the beginning. If we start right, it is easy to go right all the time, but if we start wrong, we may go wrong, and it will be a hard matter to get right. I shall comment on the very first Hebrew word in the Bible. I will make a comment on the very first sentence of the history of creation in the Bible, Bereshit. I want to analyze the word, Baith, in, by, through, and everything else. Rosh, the head. Sheet, grammatical termination. When the inspired man wrote it, he did not put the Baith there. An old Jew without any authority added the word. He thought it too bad to begin to talk about the head. It read first, "The head one of the gods brought forth the gods." That is the true meaning of the words. Beru signifies to bring forth. Thus, the head god brought forth the gods in the grand council. So the Bible really begins with the head one of the gods brought forth the gods in the grand council. Bereshit, the name of the first book of the Torah in Hebrew. And then the prophet continued, I have an old edition of the New Testament in the Hebrew, Latin, German, and Greek languages. I have been reading the German and find it to be the most correct translation and to correspond nearest to the revelations which God has given to me for the last 14 years. Now, I find it interesting that Joseph Smith, who is said to have had a 6th grade education, had copies of the Bible in Hebrew. That would be the Masoretic text. In Latin, that would be the Vulgate. In German, that would be Martin Luther's translation or a later translation. And the Greek, that would be the Septuagint. Interesting that the prophet would have these and be conversant in them. Are we conversant today? Perhaps we are not as civilized as we think we are. The prophet continued. In the beginning, the head of the gods called a council of the gods, and they came together and concocted a plan to create the world and people it. When we begin to learn in this way, we begin to learn the only true God and what kind of being we have got to worship. Having a knowledge of God, we begin to know how to approach him and how to ask so as to receive an answer. God himself, finding he was in the midst of spirits and glory, because he was more intelligent, saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest could have a privilege to advance like himself. The relationship we have with God places us in a situation to advance in knowledge. He has power to institute laws to instruct the weaker intelligences that they may be exalted with himself, so that they might have one glory upon another, and all that knowledge, power, glory, and intelligence which is requisite in order to save them in the world of spirits. And this is the purpose of this life, to advance in knowledge and become like our Father in heaven. And that is how the Bible begins. So let's briefly discuss Moses chapter 1. The book of Moses is really Joseph Smith's translation of Genesis chapters 1 through 6. When Joseph Smith started the Joseph Smith translation, this is where he began. This vision/inspiration provides the background for the creation story. It discusses how Moses received the revelation beginning the Torah. There is much to be learned with the study of this chapter. It begins with the burning bush story of Moses entering the Lord's presence. There, God tells Moses who he is. Verse 6. And I have a work for thee, Moses, my son, and thou art in the similitude of mine only begotten. And mine only begotten is and shall be the Savior, for he is full of grace and truth. But there is no God besides me, and all things are present with me, for I know them all. He then shows him the world and the purposes thereof. Then God leaves and withdraws his spirit, withdraws his presence. After a while, Satan shows up, verses 12 through 19. And it came to pass that when Moses had said these words, behold, Moses came tempting him, saying, Moses, son of man, worship me. And it came to pass that Moses looked upon Satan and said, Who art thou? For behold, I am a son of God in the similitude of his only begotten. And where is thy glory that I should worship thee? Blessed be the name of my God, for his spirit hath not altogether withdrawn from me, or else where is thy glory? For it is darkness unto me, and I can judge between thee and God. For God said unto me, Worship God, for him only shalt thou serve. Get thee hence, Satan, deceive me not, for God said unto me, Thou art after the similitude of mine only begotten. And he also gave me commandments when he called unto me out of the burning bush, saying, Call upon God in the name of mine only begotten, and worship me. And again Moses said, I will not cease to call upon God. I have other things to inquire of him, for his glory has been upon me, wherefore I can judge between him and thee. Depart hence, Satan. And now when Moses had said these words, Satan cried with a loud voice, and ran out upon the earth, and commanded, saying, I am the only begotten, worship me. Don't you find this fascinating? Satan says, I am the only begotten, worship me. What does this mean? The phrase only begotten son is very scriptural. Perhaps the most famous verse using this phrase is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth him should not perish but have everlasting life. Generally, we associate this with Christ's birth in the flesh, and we will often add the only begotten in the flesh. However, this is not scriptural. If this conversation happened with Moses, and there's no reason to suppose otherwise, then Christ still wouldn't be born for another some 1,500 years. Christ would have been the one designated to be born, but Satan was saying that he will be the one to be born. But we know that Satan couldn't say this. And also, it doesn't say that Christ will be the only begotten, but that he was the only begotten. In fact, verse 6 says that the only begotten is and shall be the Savior, for he is full of grace and truth. So possibly the only begotten could mean more than just being the only begotten in the flesh. Yes, he was the only one begotten in the flesh. But in premortality, Christ was the only one chosen to be the author of the plan. Or you could even say he was the only one begotten to carry out the plan. All we have, all of the atonement, all of our plan is based on him. He is the only one that can carry out the plan. As the book of Revelation says, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book. That is what Satan wanted. Satan wanted to be that only one. Yet Satan's plan would not allow God's children to progress to godhood. Yes, his plan would be fair and man would not be allowed to take advantage of one another. But Christ was chosen to be the only begotten, the only one given the power to carry out the plan. Satan wanted that power. Now, Christ's power extends throughout all of creation. Verse 35 says, but only on account of this earth and the inhabitants thereof give I unto you. For behold, there are many worlds that have passed away by the word of my power. There are many that now stand, and innumerable are they unto man. But all things are numbered unto me, for they are mine, and I know them. So while we know of these other creations, all that really applies to us, all that are required to know, is the account of this earth. We have all we need to become like our Father in heaven. Now Abraham 3. Now the book of Abraham is different from the book of Moses. The book of Abraham was translated from some scrolls that Joseph Smith was able to obtain. This is not the story of Moses or the story of the Torah as given to Moses. This is a different account of the purpose of the world given to a different prophet. And there's some fun stuff in the book of Abraham. In chapter 3, we could spend time discussing Kolob and Shinnah and Kokabim. But I don't know how much we would accomplish by doing so. But like the book of Moses said, we really only need to understand the things of this world. But to understand God better, let's start with verse 4. And the Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim, that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof. That one revolution was a day unto the Lord, and after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years according to the time appointed unto that whereupon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time according to the reckoning of Kolob. Do you notice the words was after the manner of? This means that this is not 100% literal. It is typographical. In fact, God gives a different dimension than lives in a different dimension than we do, so the way God lives is difficult for us to understand. A couple of years ago, I published a YouTube video on this. Search on Face Toward Zion for Easter and Infinite Atonement, and this will give some insights onto that. Now, verse 19, and the Lord said unto me, these two facts do exist, that there are two spirits, one being more intelligent than the other. There shall be another more intelligent than they. I am the Lord thy God. I am more intelligent than they all. So, as far as being intelligence is concerned, or this means our level of understanding, that we are all at different levels. God's purpose is to take those of us that are at a lower level and give us the opportunity to grow and develop. Beginning in verse 22. Now the Lord had shown unto me, Abraham, the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among all these there were many of the noble and great ones. And God saw that these souls, that they were good, and he stood in the midst of them, and he said, these I will make my rulers. For he stood among those that were spirits, and he saw that they were good, and he said unto me, Abraham, thou art one of them, thou wast chosen before thou wast born. And there stood one among them that was like unto God, and he said unto those who were with him, we will go down, for there's space there, and we will take of this material, and we will make an earth whereon these may dwell, and we will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. So this life is an opportunity that we have to learn to become like our Father in heaven. Sometimes it's difficult to see this vision, but we need to realize that, as the book of Job says, Where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Where were you when that happened? The answer, you were there. You are one of the sons of God. You shouted for joy. And where do we learn this teaching? In the Old Testament. How do you feel about the study of the Old Testament this year? Do you feel that most of it really doesn't apply to us and generally pretty boring, or are you excited to learn more truths? It's my testimony that with the Old Testament, you will get out of it what you put into it. If you study it and look for gospel truths, it will be rich and rewarding. If you basically skip the Old Testament, then you probably won't learn too much. I hope you will take this year's study serious, and together we can learn about a book that has literally changed the world, the Hebrew Bible.